I want to start off by talking about age and wisdom. The Bible seems to talk about that the older we get, the wiser we can become. But the older I get, I don't know if I get wiser or just realize how unwise I am, which might be a wise thing, right? It's funny, when you've got teenagers, they really have all the wisdom, or so they think, right? They really know how it's supposed to go. And I say that because when I was a teenager, I knew everything, right? I knew what needed to happen. I knew the way life works. I knew that this would be this way and this would be that way, and I just knew it. And my parents, they didn't know. So now I'm in a spot in my life where I have teenagers, and you know that old curse that Bill Cosby talks about, I pray you have children just like you? That works, and it works well. I love my kids, but you know, they're plagued with the disease of teenageism like I was. And so the older we get, the wiser we become, in that we begin to realize just really how small we are. Not invaluable. Don't take small as somehow less in value, but how small we are and how little we really, quote, know. As we get to the end of the book of Joshua, we're actually getting to the end of Joshua's life. And Joshua is he calls all of the leaders together, both in chapter 23 and chapter 24. Some people believe that two chapters overlap, like it's actually the same message. It's just two parts, but it's the same time. But Joshua really gathers these folks together, and he's going to give them some parting words. Okay, so if you just pick it up, chapter 23, verse 1 is where we're at. He says, after a long time had passed and the Lord had given Israel rest from all their enemies around them, Joshua, by then a very old man, summoned all Israel, their elders, leaders, judges, and officials, and said to them, I am very old. I like that. I want to just start off every message like that. I am very old. I guess you say that because it gives you a little bit of grace, I guess. I don't think it was news to everybody. That's like, is that what you called this here? Yeah, we know. You are kind of getting up there. You're getting long in the tooth is what they would say. But he goes on. He says, I'm an old man. You yourselves have seen everything the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. It was the Lord your God who fought for you. Remember how I was allotted an inheritance for your tribes, all the land of the nations that remain. And what Joshua's going to do, he's going to gather up the people, the nation of Israel, the leaders, the elders, all of them that are in authority. And he says, listen, I'm getting old, and I'm starting to realize how small of an influence I really have. And so I really want to speak to you before I die about some things that are really important. I had a friend of mine who, some of you may remember him, Mike Vaughn. I know some of you weren't here when Mike was here. Mike was here when we first moved into this building, when we were meeting in the Old Mill District. And Mike ultimately died of leukemia. But I remember when he was first diagnosed with it, it was a really, really, obviously a serious deal. But he went up to OHSU, he got a bone marrow transplant, he came back down, and it looked like it had taken, and it was great. And I remember having coffee with him, asking him about what life is like now once you've stared down the barrel of eternity, what that looks like. And he said something that I've always remembered. He says, Mike, life is very, very simple when you're counting your days. Like a lot of the stuff that I worried about, it's very, very simple. I think that life is pretty simple for Joshua right now. And he says there's 3 or 4 things I want you to know. So I'm just going to pull these out by words, and we'll talk a little bit about them. The first one he says, and we just read that there in verse 4, remember. Remember. Joshua has lived over 85 years. He's probably 90 years old at this point. Joshua was there when they were slaves in Egypt. That's how old Joshua is. Joshua remembers the 10 plagues. Joshua was there when they first got to the promised land, and he was part of the 12 spies. Remember, it was Joshua and who else? We talked about him last week. Remember, Caleb was the other guy, okay? And he was there, and he remembers when the people voted against going in, and he remembers wandering for 40 years in the wilderness. He remembers the quail and the manna and the complaining. He remembers Moses striking the rock and being punished, both him and Aaron, and not being able to go in. He remembers the second time when that generation died that he led them, him and Moses led them all the way to the east side of the Jordan. He remembers all the battles and all the fights and crossing Jericho. I mean, he was there at the crossing of the Red Sea and the crossing of Jericho. He has all of these stories, and he says, listen, I want you to remember what the Lord has done. I got to tell you, in my life, when I start to stress out about the future, normally the first thing I'm given when it comes to counsel, someone says to me, hey Mike, don't you remember when God got you through this, and He got you through this, and He got you through this? I highly doubt, Mike, God got you all this way to drop you like a hot potato. Like He did all of that to get you to this place, and boop, there you go. I got you this far just to drop you. It may feel that way sometimes, but it felt that way the last time, right? How many of you believe, you don't even have to take a show of hands here, how many of you believe that right now you're going through the toughest time in your life? You might say, well, yeah, I'm going through the toughest time in my life. Well, the time before that, was that the toughest time in your life? Yes. Did you get through that? You can all nod because you're here. Yeah. Right, yes. I know you did because you're here. In fact, just turn to the person next to you right now and say, hey, you got through it. Just let them know right now. Chris, you got through it. I got through it. You guys got through it. You got through it. See, that's the thing. We got through it. And you'll get through this. Now here's the thing. You're not going to come out the same way you go in. It's not designed for that. At least hopefully not. If you come out the same way that you went in, rest assured you're probably going to make another lap on that thing at some point. The Lord loves you way too much to have you stuck there, okay? So that's what's happening. So Joshua says we need to remember. So if you go to 24, if you jump back down to 24, if this is the same message, and I kind of think it is, verses 1 through 7, he says, I want you to remember the days past. In fact, go to 24 verse 2. It says, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel says. Long ago your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. And so what Joshua does is he sits down with the people and says, all right, first thing is that remember Abraham and his parents? They know tough times. And they know what it means to worship false gods. And yet the Lord was with them. He says, remember Jacob and Esau and that whole family drama. The Lord was with them. He says, remember Moses and the Exodus. God was with them. God's been with them through all of this. He's going to be with you. So he gives history as to the legendary past, is what I like to call it. And then he says, and remember our past, our recent past. He talks about defeating the Amorites. This is 24, 8 through 13. How we defeated the Amorites, and we defeated all of the ites, the Girgashites, the Gibeonites, all the Jebusites, all of the ites. We conquered all the ites. Remember those guys? He says, remember Balaam? This is an old story from way back, but remember the story of Balak and Balaam? Balaam tried to curse Israel. Does anybody remember what happened every time Balaam gave a curse on Israel? What did God do? Anybody remember the story? We can reteach it if you like. Balaam, every time Balaam tried to curse Israel, God blessed them. God took every curse and God turned it into a blessing for the nation of Israel. And so what Joshua says, listen, you're going to have people that are against you. Don't worry about it. Even if they curse you, you know what God's going to do with that? He's going to bless you with it. So just understand. Remember the stories. Now, I want to say this because I think it's important for us as a church family to hear this. Your stories are meant to be told. Some of you are going through tremendous heartache right now. I know because you've shared it with me. Well, I want you to know something. I know that there's more than one person in this room going through tremendous heartache. I would love for this person and this person to share their stories. Now, I can't make it happen, and I'm not going to impose that. I'm going to say, okay, you and you come together. They're going through this, and they're going through this. You're going to be like, what? I told you this. I'm not going to do that. But here's what I am going to say. I'm going to say is that it's important to know that your stories are so vital. They're so vital to what's going on. They're so vital to what's going on in this family, and they're meant to be told. They're meant to be shared, to remember what's happening. And so Joshua says, first thing we need to do is we need to remember. Secondly, he says we need to be strong. 23 verse 6. Be very strong. Be careful to obey all that's written in the book of the law without turning aside to the right or to the left. And then in 24:14 he alludes to this again. He says, now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your forefathers worshiped beyond the river in Egypt and serve the Lord. So he says, number one, remember. Secondly, be strong. Does anybody remember the little phrase that Moses repeated and God repeated to Joshua a bunch of times right at the beginning of this book? Anybody remember? Be what? Anybody know this? Courageous. Be strong and what? Courageous. Be strong and courageous. I was with a friend of mine last week and we were talking about this whole thing with Caleb and Joshua. And remember Caleb last week? Caleb was 85 years old. He was part of that duo that went and scoped out the land of Israel the first time and came back. And remember Caleb's response? Caleb from last week, he's like, yeah, we could have done it. But instead, now he's 85 years old. He's going to go and he knocks down the Jolly Green Giants. I mean, he's just a little fireball, old Caleb was. Well, Joshua is the one that's given the nod to lead Israel, not Caleb. Now, I don't want to read too much into it, but I do think it's interesting that Caleb, being full of gumption and vinegar and this blah, he has to watch Joshua do this. Now, Joshua's told a number of times, be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous. If you have to tell somebody to be strong and courageous multiple times, what can you insinuate about the person you're talking to? What are they not, typically? At least naturally. No one told Caleb be strong and courageous. I think they told Caleb, hey Caleb, may want to tone it down a few notches, You're being a little too courageous. But Josh is like, be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous. So here's the thing. Joshua, throughout his life, fought the enemies that were in front of him. I don't think Joshua had a problem battling the foes that are in front. I think Joshua struggled with, remember those Girgashites, the Gibeonites that came and they pretended to be poor. Remember the story? And he tricked them. And they come in and they say to Joshua, hey Joshua, we are so broke. We don't have money. We don't have food. We're barely making it. We're barely surviving. We're from a faraway land. Will you just make a peace treaty with us? Now what did the Lord tell Joshua and the people to do with all of his enemies? What was he supposed to do? He's supposed to get rid of them. But here these people come in with a little bit of pity. And what does Joshua do? He gave in. Being strong and courageous doesn't always mean it's about fighting. Sometimes it's about being willing to say no to somebody and dealing with the emotional toll that comes with that. I think Joshua struggled with that. Now again, he wasn't perfect, and I don't think the Lord held it against him, but this is one of those things. Be strong and courageous. Joshua knows this. He's like, man, you got to hold your ground. Number 3, letter C. You know. Take a look here, 23:14. Now I'm about to go to the way of all the earth. You know with all your heart and soul that not one of all the good promises the Lord your God gave you has failed. Every promise has been fulfilled. Not one has failed. So Joshua says to them, you know this. You know everything about this. God has been so faithful along the way. You know this. And you know that if you decide to break covenant with God, it's going to come back to bite you. You know this. I just want to make note on this little point and say, this is going to sound weird. There aren't any exceptions. There aren't any exceptions to the way life works. I know some of us think that we're the exception, but it doesn't work that way. Remember, God says, don't be fooled, God's not mocked. What a man sows, he what? He reaps. That is something that's so vital to understand. In Acts 2:42, when the Christians first came together, they did 4 things. They committed themselves, or they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking of bread, and prayer. I call these the 4 spiritual food groups that every Christian needs to somehow be getting into their life. Now, I don't know how you do it. That's not really the issue. It's just the fact that you're getting it. And you don't have one of these food groups, and it will take a toll on you. Because I've met people, they say, hey, you know what? I just stopped going to church, but I'm the exception because I was raised in a church and I know everything about the Bible. I went to Bible college and I did this and I did this. And I'm saying, well, that's really cool and fine. Again, I'm not the judge, but I just know over time I have not met a person yet where after being gone for so long, they don't slip back into old habits and old patterns, old ways of thinking. And I use the word relapse intentionally. We relapse into old thinking. And old thinking leads to old behavior. So Joshua says, you know this is true. Now, I know there's people here that say, but Mike, you don't understand. My life is different than everybody else's. My life is different. This book, it's a great book. I really appreciate what you're saying, Mike, but you don't understand the problems I'm going through. You don't understand what I've been through. You don't understand this. And you're probably right. I probably don't understand it. But here's the thing. There is what I call terminal uniqueness. Anybody know what I mean by that? You have terminal uniqueness, which means you think that your uniqueness somehow means that none of this stuff applies. If you don't have enough vitamin D in your life, is anybody here? You're pretty smart, Chris. If you don't have enough vitamin D in your life, what are some of the effects that come with that? You get rickets. And what's rickets?
You can't walk.
You can't walk. And ultimately, if you can't walk, what happens? You atrophy and you die. Now, is there anyone unique that doesn't need vitamin D? No, everybody needs it, right? Now, you can sit across from us and say, nope, I'm one of those guys, I don't need vitamin D. Okay, well, let's see how that works. Now, you might last more than the guy to your right or your left, but the fact of the matter is you need it. This is what Joshua is saying. In his old age, he's come to realize there's nobody that's unique from this human race. I got to tell you something. We all need people. We all need fellowship. We all need to be hearing from God. We all need to be communing with God. And we all need prayer. We all do. And your pain and your story doesn't alleviate you from the human race. In fact, I'll say it just bluntly. Sometimes we need to humble ourselves to the place where we say, you know what? I guess I am human and I do need stuff in my life. I'm not the exception. So this is what Joshua's saying. Now, once he gets done with his message, I love this. Go to chapter 24, verse 14. He says, now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River in Egypt and serve the Lord. Which, by the way, when you read these 2 chapters, there's a number of times Joshua is going to say, get rid of the idols, get rid of the idols. It insinuates here that the people are already starting to worship like the Amorites and the people of the land. They're already beginning to give up on God and start to pick up trinkets to worship. And so he says this in verse 15. But if serving the Lord seems, this is great. This is great. You should underline this, okay? And I say should because you should. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you'll serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the what? We'll serve the Lord. There are certain verses that some books are epitomized by, and I can't tell you how much artwork, Christian artwork you read that, yeah, how many of you ever heard that? As for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. We have that. So usually, if you're a believer for any length of time, you have a magnet somewhere in your house that says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Okay? It's a great verse. Great verse. I want to sit on that this morning, but I want to put it in the context of the way Joshua teaches it. What he says to them. He says, listen, you have a choice. You have a choice. I'm old. I've learned in my life that I can't choose for you. And I can't make you do anything. But I just want you to know that you can choose this. You can choose for yourself what this is about. And so in that, listen to what he says here. He says, as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. I want to talk about the "as for me" in quotations. And I use this as a slogan. Some of you have seen this on a bumper sticker or whatever else. When I first seen it, I'm like, oh, that's an interesting "live and let live." I always think of the old Guns N' Roses song, "Live and Let Die." Any Guns N' Roses? No. Okay, so, but the power of "live and let live," this slogan has really meant more to me the older I get. Because this is really what Joshua's saying here. Live and let live. As for me, the ability to look at people and say, you know what? This is for you. This is what I'm going to do. You're free to do what you want. That's hard to do. It's easy to do with people I don't know, right? Like the Chinese, they can do what they want. You know, the Canadians, they can do what they want. People in Portland, they can do what they want. Even the people that live on the west side of town, I don't care, they do what they want. My kids, you do what I want. My friends, I want you to do what I want. My family, I want you to do what I want. And yet Joshua says, for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. How do we do that? So, first one is this. Releasing people to be honest. If we're going to learn this idea of the power of live and let live, Joshua gets this. He says, I've got to be honest with you, and I've got to let you be honest with me. I love this. Fear and manipulation creates dishonest environments for everyone. Joshua honestly looks at him. He says to him, listen, out of everything we've been through the Exodus, through the wandering, through crossing the Red Sea, crossing the Jordan, having all the battles, at the end of the day, listen, if you don't get it, that's totally up to you. As for me, this is what I'm going to do. And we're going to be cool with that. And I'm not going to manipulate you. I'm not going to force you into anything. I'm not going to turn the phrase. I'm not going to emotionally guilt trip you into making a decision about anything. Because if I do, I'm being dishonest with you. And in turn, I'm causing you to be dishonest to me. Because you're saying yes to something you don't really mean. I'm going to speak really candidly here. I think that many times we have led people to Christ with emotional manipulation, and we get them in this baptistry, they come out, and they don't want to be here, but they don't want to lose their family or a friendship. They do it to placate us. They don't do it with a clear conscience. 1 Peter says that. 1 Peter says baptism is a pledge of a good conscience to God. Now I'm saying this, we're taking this in the church area, but let's talk about all areas of our life, right? People that do things for us, but we've gotten them to do this because we've skewed the facts, or we've given some false options to people. How many of you as parents have presented options to your kids, but you presented the options in such a way that letter D is the one you want them to choose, so you made A, B, and C so painful that to choose D would be the only obvious thing, right? Right? You're like, well, see, I gave them choices. Really? Were you honest with that? You'll know if you haven't been honest because they choose A just out of spite and it just makes you mad. Right? Oh. What were we trying to do? Some of us emotionally manipulate, and we use our relationships as leverage to get people to do what we want. Well, you know, if you don't come over for Christmas, you just break your father's heart. You know, if you don't, boy, you know, well, you see what I'm saying? Just the tone alone, you know what I'm saying here, right? This is how, and then what we do is we say, oh, okay, I'll go. You hang up the phone, and what do you think they're doing as soon as they hang up the phone? Gotta go there for Thanksgiving, you know. And they come, and what did we create? We've created this entire atmosphere of dishonesty. Joshua looks at them and honestly says, hey, listen, you have choices across the board. You can worship the idols of your forefathers, i.e. Abraham and such. That's what he referred to earlier. You can worship the Amorite god, you know, the ones just down the street at the 7-Eleven. You can do whatever you want to do. But you know, I've presented to you the facts, honestly. As for me and my house, this is what we're going to do. Proverbs 10:9 says, the man of integrity walks securely, but he who takes crooked paths will be found out. This is a great one. If you want to have a great passage to memorize, 1 Thessalonians 4:11. Make it your ambition. This reminds me of what Chris shared at the communion time. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. Comma. Because you're like, oh, I would love that. How do I do that? Comma. To mind your own business and to work with your hands. Make your ambition, make it your ambition to do what? Lead a what kind of life? A quiet life. How do you do that? As for me, and my house, meaning my sphere of influence, I'm just going to serve the Lord. Let me ask you, how simple would your life be if you spent the primary bulk of your energy focusing on your walk, your journey, your sphere of influence? Some of us wouldn't even know what to do with all the energy and time we'd have. We're like, geez, I don't even know. Colossians 3:9, do not lie to each other since you've taken off your old self and its old practices. Listen, we've got to be honest with each other, and we need to pursue this quiet life. This is what Joshua's doing. He's 80 some odd years old. He's like, listen, this is up to you. For me, this is what I've got to do. So the as for me, number one, release people to be honest. Secondly, see others as peers. Joshua looks at these guys and says, listen, you're not dumb. You're not dumb. You're just as smart as I am. You're just as capable. God is just as much your God as He is my God. And so here's the thing. You can make a choice just like I can. As for me, I'm going to serve the Lord. You're smart. You're intelligent. You've got a brain. You've got a heart. You know what I mean? I always think of, you got a brain. I think of the Wizard of Oz, right? I mean, you know, you got a brain. You got a heart. You got those things. Listen, make your choice. That's how you treat people with respect. This is the way it typically sounds sometimes. Well, you know, this is what you ought to do. This is the way it ought to be. Because listen, I'm 80 some odd years old. I know much more than you do. So this is what you ought to do. I know how you ought to live. I have all this experience. I have all this knowledge. This is what you ought to do. And we don't see it. We somehow, I call it this ladder effect that we have. We walk into a room and we have ladders. And so we have rungs on this ladder. And there's people that are above us that we look up to. We look up to their opinion. We value their attitude towards us. We want to impress them. They're smart. They're intelligent. And we don't see ourselves at their level. We say, oh, we're just not as smart as them. So we kind of kowtow to them. And then there's people below us on the ladder. We look down on them and say, oh man, if they just made the choices I made, they'd be just where I'm at. I mean, I'm really smart, really intelligent. Look at these folks. I really pity them. And we look down on them. And we just have one rung. And our one rung is us. So we're either looking up or we're looking down. Here's the thing. Everybody's on the same rung. But you're like, well, Mike, there's not enough room for that. Well, then I guess you're going to have to get rid of the ladder. So you're no more smarter than anybody else. Nor are you any dumber. You're not more spiritual than anybody else. Nor are you less spiritual. Let me tell you something. If Billy Graham is sitting right here, I'd have just as much, I would preach this same lesson than if whoever is sitting there that's not Billy Graham. And Billy Graham obviously being the bottom below me. Okay, so, no, I'm just kidding. We just read on the news, old Mother Teresa just got into sainthood, right? They just voted her. I don't know how you get voted into sainthood. And who votes against Mother Teresa, by the way? I want to know what the vote is. Nah, she could have worked harder. You know what I mean? Who's going to vote like that? Anyway, she voted in to be a saint. Let me tell you something. Mother Teresa and I, same level. But you have, listen, same level, and so are you. You have to treat people as peers. You're not better than them. So Joshua, when he looks at these folks, he says to them, listen, I trust you. I trust you with God, just like God is my God, He's your God. Make your choice. I think sometimes we think that the people around us just aren't as smart as we are, so we need to think for them. But here's the problem. You don't have to live with the consequences of the advice you're giving to all these people. They do. And when it doesn't go well, guess who they get to blame? You. So we have to let people make their own choices. Letter C. I could sit on that point for a long time. I got to move on. So releasing people to be honest, number one. Seeing others as peers is number two. Letter C. Joshua releases others to the care of God. I read this and I wrote it down for myself. It said this: I must learn to give those I love. This is really important. I must learn to give those I love the right to make their own mistakes and recognize them as theirs alone. Do I need to say that one more time? I do. All right, great. I must learn to give those I love the right to make their own mistakes and recognize them as theirs and theirs alone. So when Joshua looks at them and says, hey, listen, you can worship the Amorite God, you can worship the God of your forefathers, you can make any mistake you want. Joshua gives that to them. Now, did they choose to worship some false gods? Everyone nod your head. Now, in the rest of the chapter, they say, oh no, we're going to serve God and God alone. And Joshua's response is, no you won't. You still got all these idols. You can't. It's impossible for you to say you're worshiping God and you're packing around all these idols. You're going to do that, you've got to get rid of these idols. Like, oh yeah, we're going to do that. And Joshua's like, yeah, right. And so he's like, okay, but here's the deal. You say you're going to do it, you got to do it. Joshua knows. But whatever mistake they make, it's their mistake. How many of you are carrying around the guilt of mistakes of others? Thinking, if I was just a better dad, if I was just a better husband, if I was just a better employer, if I was just better at my finances, if I would have just been kinder, if I just would have called them, if I would have just reached out to them, if I would have done this and I would have done this, then maybe they wouldn't have done this, and maybe they wouldn't have done that, maybe they wouldn't be in this spot, maybe they wouldn't be addicted to this, and maybe I wouldn't be. I want to just tell you something. Listen, these are their mistakes, they're their choices. It's theirs. Now you might say, oh, but Mike, you don't understand. You're right, I probably don't. Everybody is responsible for their own pain. And you're not responsible for how another person deals with their pain. You're not responsible for how somebody else deals with the pain. You say, but Mike, I caused the pain. Okay, no one's arguing that. But what they do with it, you don't have any control over. All you can do is make amends. All you can do is go and try to make right to the best of your ability. But outside of that, it's theirs and theirs alone to deal with. And they have to decide what they're going to do with it. If they're going to take it and turn into bitterness and resentment and hatred and blame, that's theirs and theirs alone. And let me tell you something. There will be people out there that will say, no, this is your fault. This is your fault. And with the guilt that you have, you'll say, yep, it is. You'll eat it up. And you'll find your checkbook draining, your day planner filled up, your life totally in disarray because of the choices and mistakes of others. Let me tell you something. I just want to say this really clearly. You've got to let them have their mistakes. It's theirs and theirs alone. That's the most loving thing you can do. It's the most loving thing you can do. You say, but what did Jesus do? Jesus wouldn't do that. Oh, I'm glad you brought up Jesus. Matthew 19. Matthew 19:16. Now a man came up to Jesus, asked him, Teacher, what good thing must I do to get eternal life? Why do you ask me what's good? Jesus replied, there's only one which is good. If you want to enter life, obey the commandments. Which ones? The man inquired. Well, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't give false testimony, honor your father and mother, love your neighbors yourself. Well, I've done all those, the young man said. What do I still lack? Jesus answered, well, if you want to be perfect, go sell your possessions, give to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. And when the young man heard this, he went away sad because he had great wealth. In verse 23, in the Codependent Bible, it says Jesus ran after him afterwards. Said, whoa, time out. I didn't mean to make you sad. That was all my fault. You misunderstood me. I didn't mean everything. I mean only 7%. And even then, it just can be the here. Anybody got that translation, by the way? It's my fault. I made you sad. Oh, I feel so bad. This is my fault that you're walking away. I mean, someone could say, boy, Jesus, man, now he's not going to come back to church. Look what you did. Now he's not going to get saved. Look what you did. You should have worded it like this. You were too rough. Jesus is like, hey, listen, he has choices. You want me to lie to him? You wanted me to lie? The most loving thing I could do, the most loving thing I can do is give him that. This is his choice. So guess what? The rich young ruler, if he comes back to the Lord, which we don't know whatever happened after that, right? Maybe he changed his mind. Maybe he came back. We don't know. But if he does come back, he comes back what? In honesty and integrity. That's what you have to do. Now, some people at this point may be listening to this message and say, yeah, but what about love? What about compassion? What about forgiveness? There's nobody saying that that's not involved in this story. Which leads me to letter D. Love is not synonymous with interference or pity. Sometimes we think, well, Mike, the loving thing to do is to rescue them. The loving thing to do is to jump in between them and the consequence. And so, we've got to come in and I've got to pay that bill, and I've got to show up there, and I've got to bail them out, and I've got to have this, and I've got to have that, and I've got to do this, and I've got to do that because I love them. And if you love them, you can't see them go through hardship if you love them. Right? Or I feel so bad for them. I've had so much pity on them that they look so helpless. They look so frail that I have to help. Friends, that's not love. That's not love. Sometimes the most compassionate thing I can do is let others take responsibility for their behavior. Sometimes the most compassionate thing I can do is to let others take responsibility for their behavior. Do you know who the hardest person is that has to deal with this is? It's not the person going through the struggle. It's the person that watches the person go through the struggle. Most of the time, when I jump into somebody's life and want to help, it's not necessarily because I want to help them, because I just can't stand watching them hurt. And I'm not doing it for them. Guess who I'm doing it for? Really, rock bottom. I'm doing it for me. Now, I know there's some here that are going to say, hey, wait, Mike, are you saying we don't help people out? That's not what I'm saying at all. All I'm saying is that we got to make sure that am I interfering or am I giving pity to somebody that really the most compassionate thing I can do is let them wrestle this thing out. So let me ask you a question. How did you grow up? How did you learn? How did you learn to wrestle with something and to have grit through difficult times? I bet it's because you had to get through it. Joshua looks at these folks and says, listen, I'm not going to interfere on this. This is between you and God. If you want to worship the Amorites, if you want to do that, totally fine, totally up to you. You get to live with all that comes with that. If your crops burn and your house burns up and all that stuff that comes with that, that's for you to deal with. Joshua says, I'll lovingly help you, but I can't do it. It's a story of a wife who was married to an alcoholic, and the alcoholic husband used to roll out of bed every night and fall on the floor. And she used to go to the bed, go into the room, and she'd have to wake. She was in bed. She'd have to wake up, go and help him back in bed, and go back to sleep. Well, he'd do this multiple times a night, and so she finally went to her sponsor and said, hey, I'm not getting any sleep. I'm tired because my husband keeps rolling out of bed. And she said, well, why are you doing that? Because he keeps rolling out of bed. He's on the floor. He's like, well, that's him rolling on the floor. Why do you... You're losing sleep over your husband. He's not losing any sleep, is he? No, but you're losing all the sleep. So now, her response was, so I just stepped over him and started going to bed. Well, she did that for a while, and she realized, well, there was almost some resentment to it. So she said then what she ended up doing was she laid a blanket over the top of her husband so he wouldn't get cold as he slept on the floor, and then she slept at night. Lovingly cared for him, and yet knew where the boundary was for her. As for me and my house, I'll serve the Lord. Now, I'd love to say, well, Mike, but what about this situation? I don't know. I don't know your situation. I barely know my situations. Amen? Amen. So this is between you and the Lord as you wrestle this out. Which takes me to the last one. Oh, wait, I don't want to skip this. This is a great line. Talking about knowing things. This is a prayer by Peter Marshall. It says, Lord, when we are wrong, make us willing to change. And when we are right, make us easy to live with. Anyone say amen to that? Listen, this whole thing about interference and pity, just make sure, just because you know what's going to happen doesn't mean you should be the one interfering. Sometimes a healthy way to live is to stand back and you can see the train wreck coming. You see the handwriting on the wall. There's nothing you can do. Takes me to the last one here. Letter E, keeping the focus on me and my journey with God. I know some people will think that I'm preaching narcissism, just focus on yourself. That's the farthest thing from the truth. The only way that I can help others is if I'm healthy myself. This is what we do like when you're on an aircraft, right? And they say that if the cabin loses pressure and the masks fall down, who's the first one to get the mask? You. And then once you get the mask on, then who do you help out? The kids, right? Now we would typically think, well, put the mask on the kids first, but here's the problem. If you're not healthy, how are you going to help your kids? I know it goes counterintuitive to all of us like me who are codependent. I don't care about myself. I just want my kids to live. Totally appreciate the sentiment. But the best thing you can do for your kids is to make sure you're okay. That's what we're talking about here. Some of us are so unhealthy emotionally and spiritually because we're giving ourselves to everybody that we don't even know what we're giving anymore. We're just doing what everybody wants us to do and what everybody needs to have done. And we're not in a healthy spot to ask ourselves the question, wait a minute, do I even have a me anymore? It says, as for me and my house will serve the Lord. Is there even a me here? When's the last time in your life that you've had joy and rest? And how long ago was that? Now remember, it'd be easy to say, yeah, but Mike, it's not my fault. I've got this. Now we're going back to our own choices, right? Now the text falls on us. Hardest thing you'll ever do in your life is to give the people you love the most over to God. Hardest thing you ever do. But if you don't, you'll emotionally get sucked up and you'll die. The Lord's going to take care of them, just like He's taking care of you. Be in their life, love them, care about them, but not at the expense of the me and my house. That's got to be taken care of, because that's all you really have any influence over, really. So this is where the Lord challenges us. So let's pray. So Father, I just thank you so much for your love and your grace and your kindness and your mercy. Ask God this morning that you would encourage our hearts. Encourage our hearts as we learn this. Lord, it's tough. It's really tough. We got people we love and we got people we care about, and we have worries, and if we're not careful, our minds drift towards doomsday scenarios for people we love. And we think to ourselves that just because we have the resources to help, that means we should. And we have an enemy that loves to whisper into our ear that we're to blame, we're responsible, that it's our job to save them. But Lord, our job first and foremost is to be loved by you. And in that love, you give wisdom and a peace as we give it away to others in a way that is honest. We're honest with ourselves and we're honest with others. So, Father, we just thank you. We love you. Help us to be people that love well, starting with learning how to love ourselves and then giving that to others. So we thank you, and it's in your name we pray. Amen. So let's stand this morning. We have one last song.